The theme for the Metropolitan Museum of Art's annual ball and fundraiser this year will be Sleeping Beauties, Reawakening Fashion. And while the Met Gala won't happen until after this episode airs, there is so much to cover to get you ready to appreciate both the outfits that are going to be worn and the pieces in the exhibit.
In today's episode, we will discuss the fascinating topic of historical garments, reinterpretations, and the designer codes that allow fashion legacies to continue to live on.
And of course, all of this will be tied back to how we can use this as inspiration for our own home sewing adventures.
Hello, and welcome to Threaded Together, a podcast that stitches together home sewing and high fashion. We're your hosts. I'm Tracy.
I'm Rebecca, and in today's episode, we'll be discussing the legacy of high fashion garments and the upcoming Met Gala. This is our 16th episode, season 2, episode 4 for Threaded Together, and we are so excited to have you.
And we are thrilled to have you back listening to us again.
And a quick plug, we've been talking about giving you a behind-the-scenes peek into what we've been working on via our newsletter, and that will be coming out with this episode. So if you haven't already, pop over to threadedtogetherpodcast.com and sign up so you won't miss out. Well, Tracy, I don't have much to show for my sewing in the past month, so why don't you kick us off before we dive into our main topic?
I've had some sewing time. Thank goodness for long weekends. Yeah, I managed to do some sewing. I did my finishing touches to my pink trend patterns coat that I've talked about in many episodes. I just need to sort the buttonholes on that now. So I'm going to take my time on that because I won't be wearing it for a few months, I think now. I also made this gorgeous Fibre Mood Diddy pullover out of this wavy checkerboard Sherpa fabric from Fabric Godmother.
Ooh,
And I'm wearing it right now. It's lovely, snuggly pullover.
that's amazing.
Very, very pleased with that. And then I've just been getting through lots of little bits of sewing. So there's a gilet, which is the beige gilet by Atelier Scammit. And this was in the Fabric Godmother Dream wardrobe that I subscribed to. And it's gorgeous, all quilted fabric. And so I've made a gilet in that. But you'll be happy to know I was mindful of what to do with my scraps at the point of cutting out my project. I think prompted by a discussion in the last episode, and I decided it would be a nice fabric to try and make oven gloves with. So I used a pair of gloves I already have and as a rough template, and then I used some heat resistant insole bright wadding to make it heat resistant in between. So I'll report back on how actually heat resistant it is. Maybe there might be something wrong with the polyester content of the fabric for how well it works. But I'll report back. I thought it would be a good use of the fabric.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah. So I made myself a pair of linen shorts for my holiday, and that's the Tasiti Esther shorts, and I made them in a matching fabric to a jacket I had. So yeah, nice cord set.
So you already had that jacket because you told me you made shorts, and I was like, "That's the same print as the jacket."
Yeah,
It's so fabulous
yeah.
together.
That was something that had been in the to-do list for a while, but yeah. And then I also managed the Tilly and the Buttons Marnie dress as well. So yeah, quite a productive sewing month.
Wow. I mean, I think you've sewed enough for both of us, so I'll just let's see. Last episode, I said I was going to try to make a few things for my little holiday I went on, but I only ended up making my husband a pair of trousers.
Mhm.
They were this linen silk
Ooh.
with functional non-zip fly in this gorgeous yellow. I wanted to steal them for myself when they were done. So I might need to make another pair just for me, but you'll be proud of me, Tracy, because I shrunk the dickens out of that fabric before I cut them
A
out.
good pre-wash, well done.
Even then, I think, but that was more the pattern's fault. They just barely were long enough. But again, I do think that was more of the pattern rather than my lack of shrinkage. So jumping right in, let's chat about the upcoming Met Gala, as I think it sets the stage so well for our discussion today. So, as we said, the theme is Sleeping Beauty's reawakening fashion, and the exhibit will center around 15, quote, historically significant pieces that are too fragile to be worn, and featured alongside them will be garments that have been inspired by those pieces throughout history. We've said that we think this is actually a very relevant pop culture topic as well, isn't it? Since the place where we see these garments outside of a museum is usually only on celebrities on a red carpet.
It's an interesting kind of meta theme for the Met Gala, since the attendees obviously can't wear these delicate pieces, and the dynamic between celebrity culture and these legacy garments is then called into scrutiny as well.
Is truly fascinating. To orient ourselves here, I think we should start with what we know about the pieces being featured and the fragility of garments and why they might need to be displayed in a unique fashion.
Mhm. In the brief released by Vogue prior to the event, they mentioned the inclusion of the Charles James butterfly dress. And long-time listeners of our podcast will know we are very much Charles James fans. The butterfly dress is made from silk chiffon, silk satin, and 25 yards of nylon tulle. It weighs 18 pounds, which is over
Wow.
8 kilos. This dress was one of the first strapless dresses in couture, and the butterfly ball gown also features a heightened bust to create an elongated torso. There's a tucking treatment on the bodice that covers the whole of the sheath, and then an enormous bustle skirt that with these satin side flanges that would have this incredible movement as the wearer walked or moved around. The tall skirt uses layering of different shades to add a depth of tone as well.
Wow, that sounds just incredible and makes sense, I guess, that with the weight of the fabric combined with the delicacy of it and the age, that would compound to make it challenging to preserve and display. Is that what you think?
I think so, yeah. There's a really interesting write up about inherent vice in the book Charles James Beyond Fashion, which is from the 2014 Met exhibition. In it, it discusses how inherent vice is a term that's used to refer to a quality intrinsic to an artifact that is the cause of its ruin. So, like a form of built in self destruction, I guess. There's many, many cases of that where the things that have been used in a artifact are its own demise, right? So in clothing, it could be because of the material itself. It could be how it's been treated, how it's been constructed. So it might be beadwork on a really lightweight foundation would make it pull, or it could be the dye that's been used has made it acidic or something. I don't know. All of these things, or how it's been laundered and so on. Then the life of the garment had before it became a museum piece will have left its marks on the garment itself. And it's just a really, really interesting few pages about how they have to work really hard to conserve and preserve these garments. And I guess these problems are particularly challenging in the Charles James gowns because of the size of the gowns and the weight of the gowns, as you say, and then the
Mhm.
construction and the mix of fabrics used and then the different properties of each of the fabrics. Um, and yeah, it's must be a really, really interesting area of conservation.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad that you introduced us to that fascinating term, Tracy. I feel like an alternative title for this entire episode could then be that inherent vice, and how our discussion is basically around that topic
Mhm.
of the nature of these pieces kind of degrading through use versus their actual utility as garments. So interesting.
Yep, yep.
And yeah, I think you summarized it perfectly. And another famous set of garments within the Met's collection are the Dior Venus and Junon ball gowns. These are particularly interesting pieces because they were not specifically made for someone. They were intended to be worn by kind of celebrities on red carpets post-war, much like I think a lot of showpieces are today. And what is so fascinating about these dresses, and we have definitely mentioned this before, even talking about sustainability, is that the sequins were made out of
Mm.
gelatin. So exposed to the wrong conditions, they will disintegrate, which again is a perfect example of like you said, the inherent vice in those garments in that you wear them and they will disintegrate essentially.
Mhm.
So we'll add a link in the show notes. You can look at the Venus and Junon dresses, but they're incredible pieces and an extreme example of how fragile some of these works of art are.
Yeah, and that's a really great transition into the role that a lot of these garments play in our current pop culture.
Absolutely. And I think you can probably anticipate the segue here. We're going to stay on the Junon dress for a moment, which it's such a famous, iconic piece, maybe one of the most famous dresses from the 20th century, maybe.
Mhm.
Last year for the Cannes Film Festival, Natalie Portman wore a Junon reinterpretation created by the current creative director that almost broke the internet as people temporarily thought she had worn the original and then proceeded to dissect the reinterpretation. There's a really interesting article on Vogue UK about the ripples that this caused in the fashion world, and I will add a link about this,
Mhm.
citing archivists who were very vocal saying reinterpretations are wasteful or that the new version just wasn't as good. But viewed through a lens of the fact that the original dress would cease to exist if it was worn, I think it becomes a much more complex discussion. What do you think about that, Tracy?
I think reinterpretations are great. They truly honor the garment and the workmanship that went into the original garment, and I don't think they're a bad thing.
I would agree. And what's so funny is we have another example of the complete contrary
Mhm.
later in this episode. So we'll discuss that in a moment. But kind of regardless of your perspective on whether it was a good interpretation or not, that moment definitely kicked off a wave of reinterpretations, including Anya Taylor-Joy wearing another Dior Haute Couture take on the Junon dress, although not quite as literal, at the Oscars this year. And we'll link that as well in the show notes. You can take a look at these two reinterpretations of a very iconic dress.
We mentioned the Charles James butterfly dress earlier on, and in the 2014 Met Gala theme, it was Charles James Beyond Fashion. And at that Met Gala, Donatella Versace wore an olive body-hugging bodice and voluminous tulle train that was an interpretation of the butterfly dress. And Alexa Chung wore a Nina Ricci design dress, which honoured the sculptured sheath of the butterfly dress, so the sheath underneath. And we'll put some links in to the 2014 Met Gala so you can see some of those reinterpretations of the butterfly dress. But since then, so since that 2014 Met Gala, you can spot more interpretations of the butterfly dress, such as the dress designed by Zach Posen for Katie Holmes at the 2019 Met Gala, which is a layered tulle dress with multiple purple shades. And then what we'll do as well is we'll put another little link in so you can see all these interpretations, but and a nice big write-up about the butterfly dress.
That's so interesting. So I noticed that you mentioned the butterfly dress being reinterpreted for two, or was it three Met Gala looks in the past 10 years already. Do you think that legacy of the reinterpretation is one of the reasons they're displaying the original as part of this exhibit?
I mean, it has to be. It's such an iconic dress as well. And the interpretations, when you look at them, are so different and varied, but still honouring the original dress.
Mm.
I'm excited to see all the other pieces that they include in this exhibition and what the looks are like that interpret them as well.
Yeah, and the fact that each of the 15 pieces is gonna be accompanied by looks that they have inspired
Mhm.
throughout history, so I guess that makes that a shoe-in for that section.
Yeah, absolutely. So, continuing on the theme of celebrities wearing either the real thing or an interpreted version of it, I mentioned earlier in the year that I attended a Chanel to Westwood class by the V&A. One of these classes was presented by Adele Pramel, the head of collections at the Chanel archives. And here she talked about how certain outfits from their collection can be worn, but they have loads of rules in place to limit the risk of damage. So some of the rules include that the wearing of Gabrielle Chanel's personal items are completely prohibited. Some items have to be worn or handled with a second skin. And they will also refuse to loan any items if they're already too damaged because they don't want to make the damage any worse. She also gave an example of a shoot where she was present throughout the shoot and she dressed the models and herself. And in this particular example, she was saying that the models' movements were limited. They were only able to move their hands so far just to protect and preserve the dress itself.
Oh, wow. That is so fascinating.
And then she gave some really great examples of where the original had been worn. And so she gave this example of where Dua Lipa wore a Chanel original at the Met Gala in 2023. So the dress she wore was a bridal dress from the
Yeah.
1992 collection that had originally been worn by Claudia Schiffer.
I
And
can picture it in my brain now. Yeah. Big full skirt, kind of V'd front bodice. Yes.
that's the one. That's one. That's why you don't need visuals in a podcast. But she could only wear the dress for the photo and the red carpet, and then I think at that point she put on a replica afterwards.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's
So
literally just
interesting.
for that piece that she wore
Yeah.
it, and she made a point of saying how respectful she was of wearing it in that time and that being that, and
Mhm.
really respectful of the garment. And then there was other examples that she gave, again, around the Met Gala, interestingly. So for
Mm.
China Through the Looking Glass in 2015, um, Stephen Meisel photographed a model wearing a gold embroidered evening dress from the Chanel Haute Couture Autumn 96 collection. And so that was the real original dress. You can see other examples of Chanel archive pieces being worn in the Met Gala theme of 2018, which was fashion and the Catholic imagination. And then also Karl Lagerfeld in 2023.
So interesting, Tracy. Do you think she was covering all of that Met Gala as perhaps a little bit of a teaser for you all?
No, I think it's just a coincidence because this is all the stuff I was just like, oh wow, I never knew this. It's so interesting. And it was all things I just was like making furious notes about. So yeah.
Well, we'll have to have a retrospective after and see.
So in other scenarios, recreations of items are used instead. So in the recent film with Kristen Stewart as Princess Diana, they made a faithful copy of the look number 82 of the Spring Summer 88 Haute Couture show. And what they did here is they made two copies of the dress, one with embroidery and one without. And the one without was used for an outdoor scene. And in the show notes, we'll link to a Vogue article about this dress, and it just shows beautiful details and close-ups of that particular dress. And I think it's just so insane that they created two recreations for them to use in the film.
That's amazing, and what a dedication to that art.
Mhm.
I had no idea about the recreations for the Kristen Stewart Diana movie. I need to watch it now. But it really does bring us back to the question, I think, of utility of clothing versus their value purely as art.
I agree. And I think that Adele put it really well as a question. Is it a crime wearing a heritage item, or is it about recreating stories?
What did she say to that? Did she answer her own question, or did she just leave you all hanging?
It was just a thing that she just said, and I was like, "That's just phrased so perfectly, isn't it?"
That is the perfect segue. I'm going to now bring up a huge pop culture moment that made this very question a matter of public discourse around the world. And of course, I'm thinking of Kim Kardashian at the Met Gala in 2022, wearing the famous Jean Louis Marilyn Monroe dress.
Yes, that was quite the scandal.
Whether or not it fit her aside, there's an interesting quote by the legendary Bob Mackie, who interestingly did the original sketch, even though he did not make it, discussing the age of the dress and the damage that would be done, not specifically by Kim wearing it, but simply the dress being taken out of a controlled environment and potentially facing structural breakdown. And degradation based on that. Again, Tracy, going back to that inherent vice that you had mentioned,
Mhm.
the interviewee in this article also said that she wished Kim Kardashian would have worn a replica instead for the preservation of the garment. And I'll link that article because that's really interesting as well.
Mhm. Mhm. And it's so interesting because the fabric on that iconic dress is called marquisette, I think,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
which is also known as French soufflé fabric, and is now it's now completely irreplaceable because it was so flammable that it's since been banned. So you can't recreate it with exactly the same fabric at all.
Oh, wow.
But in reality, Kim Kardashian wore that dress for the same amount of time as Dua Lipa did
Mhm.
in the Chanel dress that we mentioned earlier, because she literally wore it just for the red carpet for the photos and then put on a replica for the party.
How fascinating about French soufflé fabric. That puts a visual in your head, not in a good way.
But maybe it's because of the association we all have with that dress. It's so iconic that makes it such the scandal.
And what a great juxtaposition to the earlier comment about wishing somebody would have worn the original Junon dress. And now here we have where the original was worn, and we have one of the co-creators of it wishing she would have worn a replica instead.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another example I'd like to discuss of the re-wearing of a garment is one we've talked about on a previous episode. And that was one that we talked about when we discussed the Crown Couture exhibition. It was a Dior dress designed by Yves Saint Laurent in 1959, but worn by Bella Hadid to the Prince's Trust Gala in 2022. And it was such a modern looking dress, but in reality, like more than 60 years old. And they'd removed the net underpinning of the dress to give it a more modern line. So the shape was more this century. But on her Instagram, if you can scroll back far enough, you'll see images of the dress she wore and another image of how it was in its original design. But I think, again, that was a real honouring of the dress and how it can still be relevant today.
Absolutely. We keep using the term reinterpretation instead of replicas. And this is the language used in the Met Gala to describe the looks worn on the red carpet and the pieces that will be accompanying those 15 special garments in the upcoming exhibit. So, what makes something a reinterpretation instead of a replica, which implies a knockoff of sorts? That's where we think designer codes come in.
So, what are designer codes? Every fashion house has its codes, those little design details that have become synonymous with a brand or a house. So, again, referencing the class that I took as part of Chanel to Westward, Adil discussed how Karl Lagerfeld used the language elements of Chanel and the reoccurring symbols or codes as, and I'm going to quote this because it was just like such a beautiful way to say it, musical notes. Each time he composed a new melody, but the musical notes remained the same.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you think about it, so for Chanel, you've got different symbols, so such as the numbers, which are used for like, number 5, the perfume, or 255, the bag. And then her favorite flower, the camellia, wheat, which is a symbol of prosperity and fertility, and something that she used quite a lot. And then the star, which was this motif that you see in her work throughout. And then the lion, which was her star sign. Her star sign was Leo, and so you see the lion
Mhm.
on like the Chanel buttons and so on, don't you?
Mhm.
And then the design codes being the colours, so the colours of Chanel being black and white and gold and beige and red, and then the quilting that you see in the bags, and tweed, which of course you think of Chanel when you
Mhm.
see tweed, and then the pearls, which we use to highlight the face and contrast the black of the dresses. And then chains. So you get the chain on the inside of the jacket and you get the chain on the bag and so on. The perfect example for how designer codes are used to translate one designer's vision into an homage into another is last year's Met Gala. All of the looks that honoured Karl Lagerfeld's time at Chanel use these codes. So, such as Valentino using camellias and Tom Brown's tweed and oversized pieces. In fact, that's a great lens through which to relook at the or listen to the episode we did last year around this time, episode 3, Unlocking the Secrets of Pattern Drafting. And in the intro, we have a lengthy discussion on last year's Met Gala. So give it a listen and see if you can spot the Chanel codes and the designer's work that we mentioned.
I know I'm gonna give it a re-listen as well. How fascinating and how exciting that we're anniversarying ourselves in our discussion of the Met Gala. The idea of a code from a design house goes beyond just a logo and really does allow designers like Lagerfeld and now Virginie Viard to continue that legacy of the house through new designs and not simply by replicating exactly what was done before. Tracy, your discussion of Chanel reminds me of the talk we went to last year during the Chanel exhibit, where Amanda Herlick said, quote, she left so much paint in the paint box that other artists could go on painting forever. Kind of reminds me of that musical quote. But part of that paint reference is the clarity of the codes and the design ethos that Coco Chanel left behind.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Another house with clear codes that you had brought up, Tracy, was Missoni.
Exactly. You can just picture what Missoni looks like in your head.
Yeah, you really can. Sony is such a great example of codes that you see, and like you said, Tracy, you instantly think, "Oh, that's Missoni."
Hmm.
You think of knitwear, but not heavy knitwear, lightweight knitwear, chiffon-like knitwear, summer-ready knits in especially those bright colors and graphic prints and that fantastic chevron and that
Hmm.
art-based legacy of the mixing patterns that's so much part of Missoni. And if you're interested in learning more about Missoni's codes, there's a great video on Missoni's YouTube that's about an hour long that's called like Becoming Missoni, and we'll link that, which talks about the history of the brand and goes through all of those codes. And it's just really clear to see how those codes have allowed the different generations to be able to continue that brand forward. And now they even have a creative director who isn't part of the family. It's due to that very clear vision that they're able to reinterpret over and over that Missoni still looks like Missoni, but also feels relevant and new at the same time.
Wow. I'll have to check it out.
Well, we've reached the part of the episode where we link back to high fashion, but this episode has been nothing but the highest of fashion. Still, there's some interesting things happening on modern runways that relate to the Met Gala and these designer codes. And I think we've covered some really fantastic examples of designer codes, but sometimes those codes are either overtly or more subtly referenced by designers that aren't from those houses on the runways.
Hmm.
Take Nicolas Ghesquier, the creative director for Louis Vuitton, as an example. And if you've been listening, you know I'm a big fan. In his autumn winter 2022 collection, there were 3 looks that included Junon esque tiered sequin dresses that had so many in the fashion world absolutely delighted. The reference was so clear, but also such a small piece of a much broader thematic collection. And yet the dresses were also styled with polo shirts, sweatshirts tied around the waist, thereby wrapping that very clear Dior nod in an eclectic sportswear package that was so clearly Guesquier's work. So showing both the Dior codes and also Guesquier's ability to make things so clearly his own as well.
Hmm.
To reference Gasquier again in a more subtle way, the designer did helm Balenciaga and revived the fashion side of the brand. And while he no longer leads Balenciaga, he often uses many a Balenciaga sculptural shape in his work at Louis Vuitton, although he always does it in a really colorful, sporty way that show his codes as well. And you kind of have to inspect the creation and the shape to get that Balenciaga reference. But I always think that's so interesting to see the way that he is able to translate the so very visible and famous codes of these legacy designers, but in a way that you really have to know what they are to be able to spot them and to be able to enhance them through his own work for Louis Vuitton. So that begs the question of how does one create these codes, and can a designer still create such a strong identity in our saturated digital world? What do you think, Tracy? Does anyone pop to mind for you that's a modern designer that's creating their own fashion codes?
I think there's lots. I think there's plenty of room to create their own designer codes. My first thought was Molly Goddard, and you can picture a Molly
Mhm.
Goddard dress in your mind, and um,
Yeah.
lots of tulle and gathering and smocking and all of those techniques
Mhm.
make those designs her own. Tom Brown is another one, isn't he?
I think Tom Brown's a great example. But
Okay,
it's not just the tailoring, it's like it's hard to put your finger on exactly what makes it, but you know it's him
yeah.
as soon as you see it.
Yeah. I think his pieces are so iconic and so clearly Tom Brown. Obviously, there's the tailoring, the beautiful tailoring, but there's the slight differences, the oversized, the cropped, the I don't know,
Mhm.
the different way he plays with tailoring, but still very very clearly his. I think he's a really good
Yeah,
one.
absolutely, yeah. And the reference to kind of American sportswear twisted on its head, if you would see that by another designer, you would think, "Oh, that's very Tom Brown,"
Yeah.
which again, that becomes the codes, yeah. One designer that springs to my mind is Jonathan Anderson, the creative director of both his namesake label, JW Anderson, and Loewe.
Mhm.
He's the designer that helms 2 arguably very different labels. And yet, if you look at his designs at either of them without being told who designed them, you'd instantly think, oh, Jonathan Anderson made them. One of his codes, in my opinion, is the ability to make a garment that is the most maximalist minimal piece you've ever seen. So let me explain that kind of seemingly contradictory idea. He takes one single idea and then blows it to such an extreme proportion, but still keeps it simple. A recent example would be the pixelated print hoodies that he made,
Mhm.
or where they have like a pixelated edge, so it almost looks like you're wearing something out of, was it Minecraft? Is that the game? I'm dating myself here. Or the clay shorts from the past year, which were actually made out of clay and the models wore them.
Oh, wow.
Or even the knit sets that he had created the most recent season that again are very simple, but are wildly maximalist in their scale, having just a handful of the knit stitches make up the top of the garment. They're so incredibly oversized. I think even with the most recent Loewe show, when you look at the proportions of some of the trousers or even the dresses with kind of that weird little sleeve pocket, all a single idea, just kind of blown out of proportion, but without adding too many conflicting things where a maximalist, might then add another idea with it. He manages to keep it very contained and still very simple. And I think there's such an art in that. You instantly know when you see any of his work on the runways that that's Jonathan Anderson piece. With all of this discussion of designer codes and reinterpretations, it makes me really curious to see the Met Gala looks that will be on the red carpet.
Yes. So, what do we expect to see?
Well, Dior has clearly been practicing their Junon for a year now. So I would expect them to do a reinterpretation. And if you look at the, Natalie Portman next interpretation next to the Anya Taylor-Joy interpretation, they're clearly playing around with what are the crowd-pleasing ways to make this dress happen. I know, so that's something that I'm thinking we might see.
I hope to see some Charles James recreations because I think
Mhm.
they're always very, very interesting to see. But I'm just aware of the fact that all of our guesses are going to date very quickly. So on the teaser, there was an inclusion of two McQueen dresses. There was the Alexander McQueen Spring 2001 shell dress and the Spring 2011 butterfly dress. And as we know, I guess one of McQueen's clear codes was the use of organic materials, including some that decay incredibly rapidly, like the flower dress we saw at the McQueen exhibit last year. So I'd love to see some reinterpretations on the red carpet that are made in a similar vein.
That would be truly fabulous.
Mhm.
Also included in the teaser for the exhibit, they mentioned a lot of sculptural garments and other unconventional materials, including an Iris Van Herpen dress in the most delicate of nylon, I think it was. They've since sadly removed that line from the teaser, so I'm trying to pull this from memory, but I hope that's because there are going to be a lot of creative, abstract, imaginative runway reinterpretations of pieces like that, or even just seeing more of her work on a red carpet would be absolutely fantastic. And I'm sure show stopping at the Met Gala. Really just hoping designers push their own creativity, which I think is much needed after last year Lagerfeld tribute, just because everything was much more
Clear
almost
cut.
wearable, I wanna
Yeah.
say. Yeah, yeah. So seeing something that really forces designers to kind of step out of their boxes using other codes would just be really fantastic.
Mhm. Absolutely.
So after all of this, how does this all factor into our sewing? I'll share my thoughts first, and then Tracy, I would absolutely love to hear yours. Again, we talked about reinterpretation versus the term of replicas. And, replicas are just creating the same thing, which does have place in all of our home sewing when you're trying to figure out how something is made. For example, we love to truly recreate something.
Mhm.
But a reinterpretation means that you take an element or a code from the original piece, an idea, and then make it your own. And exactly what designers who are creating original looks for the Met Gala do every year. They take an idea or a theme, add their codes and aesthetics to create something inspired by, but new and original. As we watch the amazing looks that will be worn on the red carpet at the Met Gala, we can use this inspiration from them in our own projects, such as taking an element and making a more wearable version, or even maybe finding a pattern that is similar and constructing it, but doing so in a way that's a nod to the runway ready look. Maybe that's using a different material or adding a sculptural element, but something that allows you to start kind of dabbling in some of these more push and extreme ideas that make it more of a reinterpretation rather than trying to replicate a look that probably isn't going to be wearable in everyday life.
Have the outfit, the events will will find the
The
way
vent is the
to
couch. We'll find a way. Yeah.
You can always go to
What
the
do you
supermarket in a ball gown. They don't know where you've been or where you're going. I, um I think it's a really interesting question. And I think that actually taking a step back and looking at the different pieces that make up a garment and make the garment have an identity is really interesting rather than just looking at it as a whole. And you can have a lot more fun playing with the codes and the reinterpretation rather than replicating something completely.
Mhm.
It's definitely something you want to do on a bigger project though. But yeah, it's definitely something I'd like to take forward and have a play with.
I mean, maybe I've been watching too much Sewing Bee lately. But I think it's like even on a smaller project, just adding perhaps if you aren't somebody who's going to, like me, just, you know, go full hog and wear the ball gown to the supermarket, right? It's a nice way to dip your toe in a bit by trying some of these codes.
Absolutely. Actually excited about seeing all the looks that will be on show at the Met Gala.
Oh, we are so excited about the Met Gala, but we need to make some projects in this next month. So, Tracy, what are you working on?
I'm quite obsessed by the Ganni blouse at the moment, the one that everyone seems to be making right now.
Oh, is everyone? I need to look this up. I didn't know.
Everyone's making it. So it's the poplin peplum tie blouse, and I don't know. It's been taking up space in my mind so much so that I ordered some white poplin and then realised I'd already ordered some white poplin. So I guess I better get out, remove that idea from my mind.
So now you'd better make 2.
Absolutely. And what are you making, Rebecca?
Well, this is usually the time of year I am frantically making my own Met Gala themed look, which I did last year in
Mhm.
just a few days. However, I've been really busy with finishing my first crochet pattern that I'm putting out, so I decided to avoid the chaos this year, and instead, I need to find some patterns to make, actually to follow a pattern,
Mhm.
get back into the sewing swing of things, and to maybe learn some new tricks with new materials in the process. And one thing that I have actually never really sewn with is a super stretchy fabric, which actually would be a good thing to find a pattern for considering our next episode.
That's right. You've guessed it. The theme for our next episode is going to be all about summer sewing and sewing up swimwear just in time for summer and sunshine.
It's a very exciting and timely topic. We'll be covering tips to tackle the stretchy bits that, if you don't make them properly, will end up in places you don't want them this summer.
This won't be my first rodeo with swimwear, but there's still lots to learn and discuss, including a fun swimming ready cover up that's on everyone's make list, the dry robe.
And to find out what in the world a dry robe even is, I just learned myself, you'll have to tune in to our next episode.
But before our next episode, if you have any thoughts, ideas, or questions for us, you can always find us on social media at Threaded Together Podcast. In the meantime, I'm Tracy,
And I'm Rebecca, and this has been,
the Threaded Together Podcast.
we'll see you next time.
Looking forward to our next episode in a month. Make sure you give us a thumbs up on Apple Podcast or follow us on Spotify. You can find more details on what we discussed today in the show notes below or on threadedtogetherpodcast.com. And for more behind the scenes and regular updates, you can find us on all social media channels at Threaded Together Podcast.